In a February 12th, 1936 letter to fellow writer E. Hoffman Price, H. P. Lovecraft wrote about the feedback that he had received from editor Farnsworth Wright and its effect on his self-confidence. The Mountains of Madness was written in 1931, and its hostile reception by Wright and others to whom it was shown probably did more than anything else to end my effective fictional career. The feeling that I had failed to crystallize the mood I was trying to crystallize robbed me in some subtle fashion of the ability to approach this kind of problem in the same way, or with the same degree of confidence and fertility. That's a testament to the power of feedback. Writers, I think, are particularly vulnerable to it because a written text is nothing less than your thought process transferred to paper. You might say that a piece of writing is a map of your brain written in ink. When someone, like a teacher, criticizes your writing, he's criticizing the most intimate part of you. Given how painful feedback can be to receive, it's no surprise that grading essays is a miserable process for both teachers and students. Let's be frank, most teachers hate grading essays and providing feedback, and their students, in turn, hate the grades and feedback they receive. Don't tell me that's not so. During finals week, you can walk down the halls of Hevelon and hear instructors complain about the essays they have to grade. I suspect that's why so many teachers last semester struggled to grade assignments in a timely fashion. If you hate doing something, you look for reasons to put it off. When it comes to activities you love, though, you don't procrastinate. Now, if you're one of those teachers who absolutely despises grading essays, then sure, you can learn some tips and tricks to help speed up the awful process, but it's not getting at the root of the problem. At best, you slightly reduce the amount of time you spend doing something you dread. That's not good enough. This is your life. If you're going to be an English teacher, then you're going to have essays to grade. Do you really want to hate doing it? If the department wants to fix this issue, if it wants its teachers to stop procrastinating and dilly-dallying every time a fresh batch of essays are submitted, it needs to address the question at the heart of the problem. Why does everyone hate grading? Let's start with students. Why do they hate receiving written feedback? For starters, as I mentioned above, it insults their intelligence. A college essay is, whether you like it or not, a test of verbal intelligence. That's an uncomfortable truth, but pretending it isn't so is only going to prevent you from understanding your students and how they feel. Why, even the results of a word sum quiz, 10-question vocabulary test, correlates so closely with IQ scores that sociologists routinely use it to gather information about the intelligence of large populations. And students intuit this. They sense that their writing reflects on their intelligence. It may feel at times as if your job demands that you identify and correct every mistake, but be aware that an essay covered in red ink, or the bright space equivalent of red ink, is sending a very clear message to a student. Not surprisingly, many students don't even want to look at the feedback they've received. Would you? To make matters worse, teachers often treat essays as if they were paperwork, as if they were forms that needed to be filled out correctly. Did you initial every page? Did you sign at every X? Note that the content of a form doesn't matter to anyone. No one spends an hour reading a lease at a property manager's office, as long as the correct protocol has been followed. That's not what an essay is, thank goodness. An essay is an attempt at communication, at self-expression and self-exploration. When you write, you isolate and refine a part of yourself. Then you offer it to your readers as a gift. It's a sharing of yourself. When I volunteered to do this, for instance, I decided to share something of myself with you because I trust you, because I believe that if I present you with my thoughts, you might listen to what I have to say. That's the intimacy embedded in every act of writing. Again, students sense this, even if they would not phrase the situations I have. When a teacher focuses on the pettiest details and overlooks what a student at a deeper level is trying to communicate, he's rejecting that student. He's encouraging that student not to write, but to approach composition as if it were the process of filling out the world's longest and least organized form. But that's not all. Let me tell you why I personally hate so much of the feedback I received in college. At this point, I have 4 degrees, which means that over the years I've received a lot of feedback. And most of it has been absolutely awful, tone deaf, and useless. You see, for some reason, teachers feel compelled to provide feedback. I've felt that urge myself. Most teachers can't help themselves. They perceive themselves, you might say, as someone who provides advice. I've never submitted an essay, no matter how perfectly polished, and when it was returned, encountered the following feedback. Mr. Henderson, I see that there is a reason for every choice that you made while writing this. At no point did you write something thoughtlessly or without careful consideration. I may not agree with every decision that you made, but that's because we're different people who see the world and composition differently. I could tell you how I would have approached the choices open to you, but naturally you'll want your essay to reflect your personality and not mine. My impression is that you're very confident and self assured as a writer, but if there is any section on which you'd like my advice, let me know, and I'll be happy to share my thoughts on that section. No, that's not the sort of feedback that you receive in college. Instead, teachers ask themselves, if I had written this essay, how would I have written it differently? They re envision the essay, in other words, so that it reflects their thoughts, their emotions, their beliefs, their opinions, their values, their sense of style. Stripped of its paper thin objectivity, most feedback says simply this: stop thinking the way you do and think as I do. Stop believing what you believe and believe as I do. Stop writing the way you write and write as I do. Boiled down to its essence, the gist of most feedback is this: be less like you and more like me. And students are absolutely right when they toss such feedback in the trash. But we all know that students aren't the only ones who hate feedback. Teachers, many of whom enjoy reading and discussing essays in their spare time, hate providing feedback as much as students hate receiving it, which is curious, isn't it? Let's look at why teachers are just as miserable. I think there are 4 main reasons. 1, many teachers try to identify, explain, and correct every single mistake they find. That's an understandable approach. They want to do everything they can to help students improve. And let's face it, if you're teaching freshmen, there are going to be a lot of mistakes that need correcting. 2, I think many teachers worry about being unfair. They're not really sure what grade to assign, and they would hate to assign the wrong grade to a student. Again, who can blame them for that? These teachers care deeply about their students, and they want to be just and accurate. 3, many teachers spend an inordinate amount of time trying to justify the grade that they'd like to assign. They lack the confidence to say, this essay has earned a 75. So they strive to put together an airtight case as if they were about to defend their cause in front of the Supreme Court. They're worried about being challenged, perhaps even embarrassed in front of the department. And that's a legitimate concern. After all, if students are going to the department and complaining about grades being late, you can bet that they're going to the department and complaining about grades being low. Many teachers, I suspect, dislike grading essays for a very simple reason. For the essays bore them. Well, who can blame them? What's the solution? I think a more honest and empathetic approach is the only way forward. When students write essays and when teachers grade them, they need to focus on the needs of each other. Students, that is, must think about their teachers' needs, and their teachers, in turn, must think about their students' needs. That's how writing and reading work outside the classroom. Writers think about the needs of their readers, and readers accept, at least provisionally, the perspective of the writer. Both parties must, if they are to come together and learn something from each other, temporarily put aside their own egos. If they can't do that, then writing and reading will fall apart. If a writer thinks only about himself and ignores the perspective of his readers, then he'll produce a self absorbed rant that no one will ever read. And if readers challenge, criticize, or otherwise pick apart every single choice that a writer makes, then they'll learn nothing that they didn't already know. Reading and writing are not selfish acts, they are empathetic acts. They are activities that require sympathy and understanding. And we should all keep that in mind if we're to teach students how to be better readers and writers. But such an approach, and this is where you want to prick up your ears, can also help teachers grade faster. I realize that sounds like feel-good mumbo-jumbo. How can a more empathetic approach to essays and feedback, which takes the needs of students into consideration, actually help teachers grade faster? Well, let's look at some concrete examples that attempt to apply such an approach. 1. Have students, when they submit their essays, assign a grade to their own work. Ask them to identify the strong and weak points in their own essay. Why? Because the goal is not just to assign every student a grade, but to help students evaluate their own work. You won't be around forever, and in the future, they're going to have to judge what they've written. You'll find, I suspect, that students are almost always harder on their essays than you are, usually much harder. An essay that I would have given a low B, they'll give a D without any hesitation. They're merciless. As the evaluator, you have somewhere to focus. You're no longer looking at a blank page, so to speak. You have a starting point now, somewhere to begin. Are they correct in identifying the essay's strong and weak points? Since the goal is to help them understand their writing better, as opposed to arriving at some sort of ideal score, the awarding of which demonstrates what a fine teacher you are, you can focus on the issues they've identified. And the best part, you get to be the good guy and give students a higher grade than they would, if pressed, give themselves. 2. Ask students to explain what they want and do not want feedback on. Again, this can be information that they submit with every essay. And again, it helps you focus. You're no longer adrift, seizing upon every comma splice as if it were a piece of driftwood. Now, some students realize that their knowledge of, say, grammar is weak and they want to improve. Others don't want to hear about it. Do you know how many times well-meaning but clueless teachers have tried to convince me to change things that I was determined not to change? Stop wasting your time writing feedback that no one wants or will ever read. Let students be your guide. If you were working on your car and clearly struggling with it, would you appreciate it if I came up to you and, ignoring what you were trying to do, began tinkering with the engine? Or would you rather I ask you what you needed help with? Of course, some students, if asked about their writing, don't know where to begin. That's okay. Give them a chance. They'll improve. They're not used to teachers treating their opinions with respect. 3. Ask students what sort of feedback helps them the most. I offer students 3 kinds. Extensive, in which I criticize each and every mistake. Big picture, which discusses the essay as a whole, identifying 1 or 2 major issues. And appreciative, which focuses only on the essay strengths. I admit that last one is hard for me. I'm a critical person, and it's in my nature to point out flaws, weaknesses, imperfections. It's probably why I'm such a good husband. And yet, I believe that appreciative feedback, when done right, is probably the most helpful for students. The truth is that writing takes decades to master. Lovecraft was 37 when he finally reached his peak. And these are beginners, many of whom have spent very little time reading or writing anything. They don't even know what their strengths are. Appreciative feedback helps them find their essay center, and it motivates them in ways that other kinds of feedback just don't. I think Professor Emily Allen is better at giving feedback than anyone I personally know, and her feedback is almost entirely positive. When you have such a teacher, you want to do your best. They've shown confidence in you. You don't want to let them down. One of our goals, I believe, should be to think of student essays as opposed to homework, and to think of their authors as writers, as opposed to students who exist to be graded. The read aloud approach helps in this regard. It encourages you as the evaluator to treat the essay as a piece of writing. How does that work? It's simple. You record yourself reading an essay aloud. You make comments as you go. What good does that do? Well, it recreates a more natural and authentic reading experience. No one reads a piece of writing with a pen in his hand, correcting mistakes as he goes. Instead, you internalize the writer's thoughts while also asking questions, making comments, and pausing now and then to reflect. The read aloud method captures all of this. When you use it, you don't have to write, "I was confused by this sentence," in the margins. Students hear you rereading it. They hear you pausing afterwards as you struggle to make sense of it. Heck, they hear the sentence itself, often for the first time, and they see it, so to speak, from your perspective now. When you grade an essay with a red pen, you treat it as if it were a spreadsheet of words, as if every word or sentence could be extracted from that essay and judged individually. A read aloud approach treats a 7-page essay not like a bag of words, but like a 20-minute conversation, which is exactly what it is. When using the method, you overlook the little mistakes. You're not even looking for them, so you don't notice them. And you spend more time engaging with the argument itself. Personally, I capture everything. From a writer's perspective, it's all useful, and it's all real. Well, Johnny, you can hear me rambling for 10 minutes after I read paragraph 6 and its discussion of the Cold War. Is that paragraph a distraction? Does it raise questions it doesn't answer? Or are you comfortable with starting an open-ended discussion? How much control do you wish to exert as the author? Do you want your readers to ponder the topic? Or do you want them to adopt your point of view, lock, stock, and barrel? Keep in mind that you, as the teacher, don't have to explain all this to students. It's captured on audio. They can hear what effect the essay is having at any given point, and they can decide for themselves if that effect is what they want. That's the whole point. Instead of describing the reading experience, you're letting them witness the reading experience. The more conventional feedback that teachers usually give, and I'm guilty of this too, is fake. You might notice, for instance, that the structure of an essay could be confusing to readers, so you subtract points for organization, even though you weren't confused. You focus on mistakes, in other words, because you've identified them as mistakes, not because they actually impacted the reading experience in any meaningful way. If you were to listen to this presentation and, instead of interacting with what I've said, create a list of every word that I mispronounced or every sentence that I tripped over, I would never speak to you again. How would that help me? At best, it would teach me to keep my mouth shut and my opinions to myself. And yes, the read aloud method is fast, very fast. Can you talk faster than you can write, organize, revise, and edit? Of course you can. And you only have to read the essay once. That may shock some of you, but keep in mind that the goal is to move away from artificial grading practices that don't actually reflect or resemble the reading process at all. If you read each assignment 3 times, you're going to find mistakes. You'll be looking for them. And when you point them out, you'll confuse and overwhelm your students by bombarding them with a multitude of errors, some of which were so insignificant that you didn't even notice them until you read the essay a 3rd time. When it comes to writing, first impressions matter because in the real world, no one's going to read an essay more than once. But how does one judge an essay? What really matters? Maybe more importantly, who decides how an essay is judged? The reader or the author? The teacher or the student? People write because they're trying to achieve a goal, and their writing is a tool that can help them achieve that goal. Maybe they're trying to convince an employer to hire them, or maybe they're trying to persuade employees to keep the microwave clean. Now, clearly, the readers of these texts can interpret them any way that they want. That note on the microwave can become an office joke or a symbol of petty bureaucracy. And yet, the author of these texts had a purpose in mind, a goal that he wanted to accomplish, and that goal doesn't change no matter how the text itself is interpreted. As a teacher, you could tell your students what in your opinion, their essays are trying to achieve, or you could listen to their goals, which prompted them to write in the first place. And students need to be thinking of these things. If they're to become better writers, they need to think of their writing as a means of accomplishing something, of making something happen. So ask your students, what is your goal here? What are you trying to accomplish? Who is your audience, and how can your audience help you achieve this goal? Again, they can submit this information with every essay, and when they do so, they provide you with the means of judging their success, not by your standards, but by theirs. It provides you with the only question that really matters. Can this essay, in its present form, achieve the goal that prompted its creation? If you want to grade quickly, stay focused. Every aspect and component of an essay, from its title to its last period, matters only to the extent that it affects the answer to that question. So far, we've examined how you can provide feedback that addresses the needs of your students, but how can they write with your needs in mind? Let's look at some options. 1. Discourage students from writing egocentric essays that, while satisfying to write, appeal only to the author. A great many student essays, maybe the majority, belong to this category. The writer wrote down what he wanted to say as if he were in an empty closet, screaming at the walls. Unless you're writing a diary, you write because you're trying to connect with the reader. You have to keep that reader's needs and perspective in mind. Does that reader want to hear about that time you won at bingo? Maybe. If you write about that bingo experience with your reader in mind. The question is not, how can I write something that interests me? But how can I make this interesting to my reader? This needs to be stressed all semester long. Once your students stop writing essays that gratify themselves and start writing essays that are meant to interest others, you'll find the grading process much less of a burden. 2. With that in mind, be direct. Ask your students, why would I want to read this? They need to be able to answer that question. Okay, Johnny, you'd like to write about penguins in Antarctica. Why would I, Dylan Lee Henderson, want to read about that? How can you make that interesting for me? Keep in mind that your writing is not a signal broadcast into outer space. When you submit an essay, you're asking me to listen to you, to take time away from my work and my family and my hobbies to spend time with you. Now, I'll do that because I'm a dutiful teacher, but what if I were your average reader? If you don't give your reader a reason to read and to keep reading, then he'll toss your writing in the garbage. So, what are you doing on page 1, on page 3, on page 27 to interest me? That sounds harsh, I know, but teachers today are encouraging a misconception. They're encouraging their students to think of reading as some sort of obligation that readers are forced to perform. That's the opposite of what reading is. Readers are under no obligation to read anything, and most of the time they don't. My inbox is full of stuff that I'm never going to read because the authors didn't bother to think of me when they wrote it. They just assumed that I would read it because they sent it to me. When you write something, anything, you are asking for a favor from your reader. Good writers keep that in mind with every sentence that they write. 3. Ban subjects that you don't want to read. Now, many of you sat up straight when I said that. As teachers, we want students to develop their interest. We don't want to tell them that they can't write about a subject simply because we don't like it. That's a fair point. The problem, however, is that when you allow students to choose their own topics, they don't pick topics that interest them. They pick topics that are easy to write about, or that they've written about in the past. They learn little from such exercises. Indeed, one of the best professors I ever had chose the most esoteric subject he could find for each of his geography students. My subject was the economic influence of ethnic Chinese in Malaysia, a subject about which, as you can imagine, I knew very little. and as a result, I learned a great deal about it. If you must, let your students choose their own subjects for some of the assignments, but don't overlook the opportunities that assigning subjects gives you. Doing so compels your students to hone their research skills, for starters, but it also makes life easier for you. It frees you from having to grade certain types of essays that you dread grading. We all have essays like that. Personally, I dislike what you might call the confessional political essay, in which the writer tries to browbeat the reader into adopting his political views by stressing how the political situation has affected him personally and emotionally. Because such essays are so intimate and emotional, they're almost impossible to grade without offending the writer. So, even when I allow students to choose their own topics, I tell them not to submit essays of that type, and I explain why. If I want my students to think about their readers and their needs, then I, as their only reader, have to be open with them about my own needs. Maybe, having read 10,000 papers on gun control, you can no longer grade such papers objectively. If so, I think your students, some of whom no doubt are contemplating writing an essay on gun control this very minute, would appreciate it if you shared that information with them. 4. You might even go one step further and tell students about your own interest. If you'd like to read more essays on fishing for trout, why not let your students know that? When asked to choose a topic, many students have no clue what to do. Giving them a list of topics that really excite you can help. And because we all tend to know more about things that interest us, you can usually, in these cases, point students toward compelling sources or provide useful feedback during the brainstorming stage. Students who otherwise want to know what to write benefit, and you receive a sheaf of essays that you might actually want to read. Let's also look at some tactical approaches to grading faster. A complex rubric isn't going to save anyone any time. A simplified rubric, however, can be applied to almost any writing assignment, or any class for that matter. You may have already experimented with this, but if not, let me explain what I've done. I've divided the most important issues I encounter into 3 broad categories: sentence level, paragraph level, and essay level. Because I'm a perfectionist, there are exactly 15 issues at the sentence level, 10 at the paragraph level, and 5 at the essay level. Sentence level issues, that refers to things like word choice, clarity, specificity, quotations, capitalization. Paragraph level issues refer mostly to organization, development, and sources. Is it clear why this paragraph goes here? Is its purpose in the essay readily apparent? Is its central idea adequately developed and defended? Are the sources cited reliable or authoritative? These are the sorts of questions that pertain to paragraph level issues. But essay level issues, they're what really matter to me. One of the benefits of creating such a rubric, by the way, is it forces you to think about what good writing really is and is not. Does the essay, for instance, treat opposing views with respect? Does it oversimplify its subject? Does it explain why that subject is important? Each of these 3 categories is worth 10 points, which means that if a student submits an assignment that fulfills the requirements but has major issues at the sentence, paragraph, and essay level, then that student still receives a 70, a little bit more than a D. If there are some noticeable but not severe issues at a given level, I deduct 5 points for that level. That means that an assignment with some minor issues at the sentence, paragraph, and essay level receives an 85. It's simple and intuitive and fast, and it makes sense to students. It also helps students during peer review, especially those who aren't sure what to focus on. 2, once you've created a universal rubric, you can slowly add comments to it, gradually explaining the significance of each issue you've identified. Once the resulting document is complete, you can simply refer students to it. There's no reason to write lots of comments in the margins. I've found myself explaining over and over again the purpose of a topic sentence, for instance. So all you need to do is post your guidebook in a prominent place and then point students toward the relevant section. 3. Focus on the handful of essay level issues that you've identified. These are, in your experience, what separate good writing from bad. These are the issues that, no matter how well the text is written or structured, will bring down the entire essay unless they're addressed. Let me give an example. I think humility is absolutely central to writing a good essay and to effective communication in general. The writer must accept, at a very deep level, that he doesn't know everything, that others might think differently, that they might even have valid reasons for thinking differently. Now, if a writer approaches an essay from the opposite viewpoint, believing that the truth is simple and straightforward, and that he possesses it, and everyone who sees it differently is wrong, then he will not produce an effective essay, and there will be nothing he can do to salvage it. Now, there may be other issues out there that matter more to you. That's fine. What matters is that you spend most of your limited time focusing on the all important issues you've identified, whether you're in the classroom or providing feedback from home. Don't try to teach your students everything. There's too much they need to know. They would just become overwhelmed and confused. Instead, each unit isolate one or two essay level issues and stress those again and again throughout the unit. Students aren't going to become good writers in a semester, or in a decade for that matter, but this at least helps them establish a firm foundation for later growth. And it saves you from trying to evaluate every aspect of writing, from punctuation to persuasiveness. 4. As for sentence level and paragraph level issues, address those some other time. When grading essays and providing feedback, stay focused on the essay level issues, the things that really matter. Everything else can wait. Take sentence level issues, for example. I would recommend that while you're grading essays, you keep track of some of the most common mistakes. Mention in your comments that there were some, or a great many, sentence level issues, but don't try to identify and explain each one. Instead, go over the most common issues in class after you've finished grading all the essays. If an essay, however, is absolutely riddled with such errors, you should return it to the student and ask that they revise and resubmit it. That's not being cruel. Doing so provides you with an excellent teaching opportunity. Students don't realize how disrespectful and counterproductive sentence level errors really are. Things like confusing sentences or misspelled words indicate to the reader that the writer is either incompetent or careless, or both. Indeed, he cares so little he hasn't even bothered to use spell check. Why would anyone read such an essay? In the real world, no one would. If I picked up an article in the paper about nuclear power and the writer of that article misspelled nuclear or power, I'm not going to finish reading it. I'll know that the writer is not a serious person, and the paper will go in the bin. As for paragraph level issues, those are best addressed before the essays are submitted. You could have students submit an outline, a practice that most students would be wise to adopt anyway, and then during student conferences you can point out better ways to organize the argument. I ask for somewhat detailed outlines that contain topic sentences, sources, and the purpose of each paragraph. If you assign subjects or let students pick from a small pool of topics, then you can address some of these issues in class as a group. This way, the major paragraph level issues are resolved before you even begin grading, which frees you up to focus on those issues that really matter. I don't know that the approach that I've outlined is the best way to think about grading and feedback, but I do think I'm on the right track. You see, as English teachers, we are a long way from where we should be. Grading, after all, should be fun. Reading and pleasure go together, just like eating and pleasure go together. There's no point in baking a cake that tastes so bad that no one wants a slice. A written text must be, in some way enjoyable or satisfying, be it intellectually, emotionally, imaginatively, aesthetically, or spiritually. If it's not, no one's going to read it. A well written text that no one wants to read is not well written, and it will ultimately go unread. And as a result, it will fail to accomplish whatever goal it was written to achieve. The fact that it was well organized, or correctly spelled, or extensively researched, or whatever won't matter a bit. The essays that students write should bring their teachers pleasure. And the knowledge that someone is taking their beliefs seriously should please and encourage students. That's the goal. That's how writing actually works outside the university. You should want to read your students' essays, and your students, in turn, should want you to read them. Permitting and even encouraging students to write essays that interest no one makes a mockery of the writing process, and it fosters a train of thought. Writers don't need to think about their readers. That is absolutely anathema to good writing. If at any time you don't want to read a student's essay, or that student doesn't care whether you read it or not, then there's a problem at the very heart of that text that supersedes all other issues. Thank you for listening, and good luck.